Now, the Cold War is in full swing during the 1950s, right? And in the mid 50s, you have the Secretary of State, right? Secretary of State Dulles, promoting this new policy of massive retaliation. Ooh, that sounds a little dangerous. Okay, so what is massive retaliation? This is where the United States is going to vow to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union were to attack any American ally. Okay, any American ally, Soviet Union attacks them, and boom, the nukes come out. Okay, now by this time, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed the hydrogen bomb. Okay, which is about 700 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. Okay, extremely powerful. So imagine the destruction that could happen, right? If this massive retaliation policy was carried out. Okay, so basically, the policy of massive retaliation would cause the Soviet Union to respond by also launching nuclear weapons, right? Which would lead to what is called mutually assured destruction. Hope that doesn't happen, right? Since basically both countries had thousands of nuclear weapons, if they were to attack each other, both of them would be destroyed. Okay. All right. So things start to change though in the Cold War after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. So after Stalin dies, Nikita Khrushchev will become the new premier or the leader of the Soviet Union. Okay, and Khrushchev is going to be much different than Stalin. He's actually going to call for something called de-Stalinization. Okay, kind of get an idea of what that sounds like, right? So basically, he's publicly exposing the atrocities committed by Joseph Stalin against his own people. All right, so Stalin had his political rivals or people who he was just suspicious of. He was kind of paranoid. Well, kind of. He's extremely paranoid. He has like his political rivals or people who he was suspicious of within the Communist Party arrested. He has them arrested and he has them executed. Okay, we're talking about a lot of people here. And on top of that, he also has millions of peasants sent to labor camps, and millions more are deported to really rough terrains in Siberia, right? No cold, which is going to contribute to the deaths of millions under Stalin's rule, right? Between the peasants and those who were deported and the political rivals who were executed, millions were killed under Stalin's rule. Okay, so mass death. Now Nikita Khrushchev is going to call for all images of Joseph Stalin to be removed from the public. Okay, so we're going to take down all of his images in the public, and his legacy is going to be rewritten in the history books to basically destroy his character, right? Because he was responsible for all of these atrocities. And Khrushchev wants the world to know about it. Okay, now in the United States, many people left the Communist Party after Stalin's actions became publicly known. Okay, so things are starting to change. Now, Nikita Khrushchev, he was open to improved relations with the United States, and he met with President Eisenhower, right? And so, you start to see the Cold War kind of, I guess you could say it's thawing. It's thawing out, right? So if it's frozen, if it's cold, it's not as cold. And so one example of this is the testing of nuclear weapons was put on hold for a little while in the late 1950s. But relationships or relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union began to sour again when an American spy plane, right, a U-2 bomber, was shot down over the Soviet Union. Right, it's a big spectacle, publicized all over the international news. The U.S. is got caught spying on the Soviet Union. Uh-oh. So yeah, relations got cold again. Right, so the Cold War continues. Now, during this time of the Cold War, several countries which had been colonies of the European powers like Britain and Portugal began to gain their independence, okay, from the late 1940s into the 1950s, okay? So you have a number of countries in Africa, some in Southeast Asia and South Asia, right? I'm talking about India, Pakistan. They emerged as new countries as the age of new imperialism, which we talked about before in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, new imperialism, as that new imperialism began to come to an end, okay? So, when European powers were scrambling to gain colonies all over the world, Africa, Asia, uh, in the late 1800s, that period comes to an end. It starts to come to an end as we get into the 50s, and it's a period called decolonization, okay? So basically, countries are gaining their independence from the European colonial powers, okay? Now, most of these countries did not take sides in the Cold War, right? They didn't side with the United States or the Soviet Union. So they were known as the Third World, okay? Third World. So you got communism, you got capitalism, and then you have the Third World, a different option, right? Because in the Third World, they're open to using economic systems that may combine aspects of both communism and capitalism, whatever works, right? To try to bring about equality and help uplift their nation, okay? Later on in history, the term third world comes to mean something else. It comes to mean countries that are considered undeveloped, right? But for now, in the 50s, third world is referring to these countries who are, staying neutral during during the Cold War, okay? In 1955, leaders from 29 of these third world countries gathered together in Bandung, Indonesia, to discuss their opposition to colonialism, and they ultimately came to agree that they would not support the US or the Soviet Union, as both of these superpowers exhibited characteristics of oppressive governments, okay? And they're trying to move away from oppressive governments and colonialism, and so they're going to stay neutral during the Cold War, right? So that's decided upon at the Bandung Conference, okay? Now, in 1945, right, this is around the time that the World War II is ending, after Vietnamese nationalists, right, led by Ho Chi Minh, okay, are attempting to gain independence from France, you're going to have French forces try to crack down on this independence movement, okay? So, like I was saying, at the end of World War II, you have this period of decolonization starting, right, in the mid to late 40s, okay? And so there's a decolonization movement in Vietnam. They're trying to gain independence, okay? But it's a French colony, and France is not having it. So they're sending in military forces to try to crack down. Now, although the United States seemed to support decolonization, right, France was a major ally, right, especially in the Cold War. So the U.S. gave billions of dollars to support the French effort to stop the Vietnamese independence movement. But guess what? The French were unable to crush the movement. And in fact, Ho Chi Minh and the nationalists were successful in forcing the French to accept Vietnamese independence in 1954. Okay, so after the United States refused to support the Vietnamese independence movement, I'm talking about after World War II, Ho Chi Minh, because Ho Chi Minh originally went to the U.S., right? He went to President Truman and wanted support for independence, but since France was an ally, President Truman, at the end of World War II, did not want to help Ho Chi Minh or his movement there to gain independence in Vietnam. And so instead of going to the US, Ho Chi Minh turned to, guess who? The Soviet Union, who did offer they offered him some support. So when Vietnam was eventually split into northern and southern partitions after they gained independence from France in 1954, Ho Chi Minh was left in control of North Vietnam, okay? All right? And guess what? Economic ideology he supported, right? Communism, okay? Because the communists helped his movement when the U.S. would not do it, because the U.S. supported France. So elections were eventually set to take place in 1956, right? And it was likely that Ho Chi Minh was going to win that election. And Vietnam would have become a communist country, right? Because the election was going to reunite the northern and southern parts of Vietnam in 1956. But the elections didn't take place. Didn't happen, okay? And the reason why the elections did not take place is because the leader of South Vietnam at the time, No Dinh Diem, did not allow the elections because he knew he was going to lose. Okay, and the U.S. totally supported that too because they didn't want to see Vietnam become a communist country. Remember the policy of containment, right? Didn't want communism to spread in Southeast Asia. Got to contain it. Can't allow Vietnam to become communist. Okay, so eventually this is going to lead to the Vietnam War, as Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces from the north are going to try to unify the country, right, through warfare. Okay, they're going to try to take over the South. And so we'll talk more about the Vietnam War in a later module.